Hangout is live. Hello, everyone. It's Kristi. Welcome back. And sorry, this is one of my very last minute notice hangouts. Although I will say this, it was because of a miscommunication. I didn't realize that I was the one who was supposed to be hosting. We had this whole thing where we set it all up. Like, oh, I'm hosting. Oh, okay. And that was about an hour and a half before we went on air. So you can blame me again for not being very well organized. Had everything right except the fact that I had to set it up. Anyway, I'm really excited to have this chance. Oh no, dang it. You know what I did? I started the wrong hangout. I started, yeah. Well, hello everybody. This is not the May hangout. So I just looked down at the screen and I see that, yeah, the title of it is wrong. That's okay. I can change the title after the hangout and I can swap titles. Not a problem. It just threw me off my flow, which was introducing you. So yes, I'm excited to be here tonight on this mistitled hangout to discuss yet again and further and more deeply the concept of enforced monogamy mentioned by Jordan Peterson. But I found a fellow person who was sort of moaning about this on Twitter, the account which you should be following if you're not, Embrace the Void. And I was talking with my guest tonight, Aaron Rabi. Welcome to my channel and thanks for being on.
Hey, thanks for having me, and apologies for the confusion. I will definitely host next time, I promise, and I'll bring dip.
That's all right. As long as you get the title right, you'll already be ahead of me. So
there you go.
I not only got the hosting wrong when I set up the special hangout, I went to the wrong one and started. Anyway, I'm just going to move on. I'm going to accept the failure and move right on. So before we get any further, I do want to ask the people in the chat in terms of our sound levels, of whether or not we're both pretty equal or if I'm blowing out your speakers while you can barely hear. Aaron, just give us some numbers. Give me a 1 to 10 scale as to where we're leveling out for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm seeing the right chat right now. Is anybody chatting in there?
You might be on the. I don't know if you're on the right channel.
Yeah.
Because if you're on the Hangout, I sent you for the watch link. That Hangout isn't running right now.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I really shouldn't be doing these things last minute. So yeah, I don't even know how to. I'd have to go to my channel and get it. So tell you what. I'll go check out the chat, and you can tell the audience a little bit about how you became aware of and interested in the concept of enforced monogamy, first as mentioned by Jordan B. Peterson, and then we'll move on to your take based on what you were telling me before we went on air about your exposure to a lot of ideas that give you some context for that phrase.
Yeah, this was a exciting week for me because this is a story that like hits a lot of my my buttons, right? I'm a big fan of the very fairly common kind of story of a professor says something kind of absurd and it gets confused in the media, and so everybody freaks out. And obviously that's been on the rise with people like Peterson. And often the case is either they used some sort of technical term that no one understood, or they were saying something immoral because academics say things immoral sometimes. And I think in this case, Peterson manages to do both, which I find fascinating and impressive. And so, I immediately caught on to this, but I also had recently, this past semester, been a assistant for a course that was a crossover course, a cog-sci philosophy crossover course at the school where I teach, where we looked at human nature and diversity. And so we looked at a lot of the anthropological material that I immediately kind of realized as I was reading the New York Times article that Peterson was going to be drawing from. So I got very excited about all of this and have spent the last several days sort of trying to unpack what he was arguing for. And there's been a lot of issues because some, understandably, certain non-academics have reacted to this by saying, "Are you talking about like Handmaid's Tale? What are we on about here, buddy?" And because I think Peterson likes to dabble sometimes in creating excitement by not making himself clear, he then, of course, went on and clarified and said, "I was not arguing for Handmaid's Tale. Here's the anthropological data that I would use to back up these arguments." And so I've been enjoying. There's also lots of other fun stuff in that article to play with, but we're going to not sort of distract ourselves, get bogged down with witches, I think. But I'm looking forward to sort of trying to explain because I find often with these guys, like there's some nuggets of scientific truth that they're basing it on. And even though it sounds a lot like the very bad pseudoscience that like the pickup artists have used for the past several years, like the stuff about status and prestige that ties in with all of this, right? There is some interesting historical data about this, but none of it supports the sort of conservative, regressive conclusions that people like Peterson, even in the most mild form, are going to advocate for based on this. Did I do all the things? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm also multitasking while
Oh,
we're
no
doing
problem.
this. So
I was just gonna sort of fill until you
yeah,
told me to do
that was
otherwise. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, keep yes. So please continue.
yeah, okay. So um I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I guess we should start maybe with the what he's referring to, and then we can talk about how he's kind of getting it wrong. Some, I guess, a little bit. Does
That
that make
sounds like a
sense?
great way to go about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
let's explain the actual concept and how it is used and your understanding and how you know, and then we'll compare that.
right. So enforced monogamy could be a fairly broad term that could refer to a variety of social mechanisms that are used to encourage or pressure individuals into leading monogamous lives. That could range from anything to raising children to think that a happy, stable, monogamous relationship is a key part of their good lives, or it could be banning polygamy. It could be, it could go so far as to be like a government breeding program, though I don't think that's what Peterson is actually in favor of. I think he's in favor of a much more bland kind of immoral conservatism. So there is a lot of good evidence, as far as I can tell, to suggest that in the history of the evolution of human beings, during the process when we became more cultural and as a result started to domesticate ourselves in a variety of ways, one of those forms of domestication was a shift in some cultures from polygamy to enforced monogamy as a way to combat the problem of an excess of men with no access to mates turning towards violence. So he's not wrong in the sense that this was a tool used by culture at certain points in history, including recently, to deal with essentially the problem of incels. That's what I think, one way of understanding what he meant when he said this is a cure for incels. That's a generous read of what he was trying to say there.
Mhm.
Right. So I think um, it's fair to point that out. There's also other scientific stuff that goes along with this. The fact that cultures that enforce monogamy and male individuals within those cultures have lower testosterone on average, and that those men tend to have lower testosterone and as a result tend to exhibit less aggressive kinds of behaviors, less criminality. That was what the New York Times article, I think, that you sent me was arguing for that particular sub claim.
Right.
So this is, I think it's important for liberals, if they can, if they have the time, to understand the science that is there behind these kinds of claims that these folks are making. And the same thing can be said for the status prestige kind of stuff that goes along with these arguments, right? Because the problem here is just to lay out what problem they think they're solving. Polygamy, a polygamist society allows for high status or high prestige men to seek out and acquire multiple mates, multiple female partners. That soaks up disproportionately the number of female partners that there are, leaving lower status men with less access to partners, which in turn gives them less incentive to not turn to a life of crime, basically. Right.
Right.
Um, so, uh, so what they what some societies have done have they have banned polygamy, as our society has. They have tried to encourage individuals to engage in these kinds of relationships, and so we've also done interesting studies on how this sort of status and prestige things kinds of works. And I want to sort of distinguish it from another thing that often gets brought up, which is the alpha male beta male kind of thing. I bet you're probably familiar with that sort of
Yes, that terminology.
widely debunked theory having to do
Hmm.
with wolves and things, where the guy himself has said this is not how it works in nature.
Right.
Um, what there does seem to be evidence for, and I'm a philosopher, not an anthropologist, so I can't say I know the information perfectly, but what they do seem to have is that as a cultural learning species, human beings are keenly aware of the relative status and prestige of various members of their community. And they pay attention to those things as a way to figure out whose behavior they should mimic within their society. And those status and prestige setups can be based on a variety of things. They're not just dominance, for example. They can be, an individual who's old, an individual who is really good at making tools, an individual who has acquired large amounts of resources. So there are some cases where this stuff does kind of overlap with the incel culture's views about what things people quote unquote look for. They do a really terrible job sort of understanding the full range of the data. But for example, there is some evidence to suggest that we look more favorably towards a potential partner who has more resources, basically, especially that women tend to look potentially towards a male partner who has more resources and is slightly older.
In countries that are patriarchal. There was
Sure.
some work
Yes.
done by, I think, Wood and Eagley, that when you control for, feminist influences, such as, like having education, so women's literacy, girls' literacy, access to universities, percentage of women in parliaments, women's, those preferences change based on how patriarchal the society is because of women's economic and social and political disadvantages in highly patriarchal countries.
Yeah, and it's great that you point that out. I had someone on Twitter today actually just mention that we did our incel episodes, a couple of episodes on Embrace the Void about these various different theories, and something that we could have hit harder was uh, people kind of assume that these features about men and women are permanent. They're essential in some kind of way. And you were talking about essentialism a little bit with me before the show. Like people assume because it's genetic, because it's biological, they naturally in their minds, I think in our culture especially, associate that with relatively permanent and unchanging, and not things that are easily shifted and largely driven in many ways by cultural structures.
Yes,
So,
and those measures, those metrics that show that when you control for those female empowerment things, the Gini coefficient, I think, on gender equality as well, that you do see changes. It is a social and cultural, women make different choices in different situations. Men make different choices when presented with different cultural situations because they're different, And one of the things I object to about Peterson is that he wants to sort of lock us into a Bronze Age mentality. Because one thing that I haven't heard too much talked about when we've talked about this idea of enforced monogamy and how marriage came about, this link between, male violence and the establishment of marriage as a solution to the problem. There are other accounts of why monogamy and marriage arose. There's I guess, I don't know if it would be considered Marxist account, but certainly one based on property, right? Because for most of the 300,000 years that the modern human has sort of been around, we've only been agricultural for about the last 12,000, and people date the establishment of marriage to the time when people started to farm the land, and they were in one place in large families, were very helpful with division of labor kind of thing, not division of labor, but sort of separating out or distributing the labor. And this notion too of then, sort of women as property, rather in comparison with when explorers encountered other people as they traveled around in the 17th century and as people became anthropologists, went around the world. Hunter-gatherer societies do have instances of where a child is a child of the tribe. And I think there was one particular example that I was listening to. This is on the Vox, I should shout out, by the way, the Vox video on like how marriage started or whatever. They're advertising their Netflix series Explained. But in there, they were talking to a woman, like an expert in the field, who now I'm starting to lose my train of thought because I had to go all the way back to the Vox video and come back to it. But I do remember what I was talking about before I got distracted with all of that, remembering all that information.
Alternative accounts of marriage.
Yes, thank you.
Marxist, and
That's
then
exactly it. Right. That there's an account where a French explorer was talking to a tribe in the Americas, and he said, oh, actually, it was a different one. It was the instance where there was a group of people, a tribe, and their practice was when a child was born, the woman named all the men that she'd had sex with while she was pregnant, and they were all considered that child's father. And she said, what you find is the kids with sort of more fathers actually were more likely to live because they had more people supporting them.
I'm so glad you bring this up. I was just rereading through one of the books that we used for the class that I was in. It's called The Secret of Our Success. I want to shout it out as well. It's a wonderful book about culture gene coevolution. And I was just reading through the description of the Bari tribe who have two father children. Like they believe that a child is not conceived once, like the first inception is that the ongoing reproductive act is essential to the health of the fetus and the birth of a child. And so the wives actually go out and seek second partners during their pregnancy, who they then claim, as you were saying, as second fathers, basically. And that the data suggests, like you were saying, that children with two fathers do better. So yeah, so you're totally right that Peterson has this really Judeo-Christian view. I'm not even Judeo-Christian, just Christian, right? Because the Old Testament's full of polygamy. He has this very Christian view about what is essentially the most common, he thinks, form of solution to this problem. When you're in fact right, there are many, many solutions. I think the data is like 85% of human societies have permitted some form of polygamous marriage. Whoa, excuse me. Another thing I think it'd be good to just differentiate while we're getting in the weeds here is
I'll get on my waders and
yeah, right.
boots.
Well, that we should distinguish pair bonding from monogamy,
Mm.
right? So you can have a culture that enforces pair bonding without it being a culture that enforces monogamy. So you can have a lot of cultures where individuals are pair bonded together, but they also have other partners. They're polygamist or polyamorous or something like that, right? It might even be codified within a marriage sort of thing, but you can still have this idea of the value of being tightly connected to one individual, but also being tightly connected to another. And I think that you find that's a lot more common in human nature than the more rigorous kind of enforced monogamy that I think Peterson has in mind.
Yes, and he has this assumption somehow that monogamy is this sort of natural state that civilized places tend toward it. But let's face it, all the evidence really kind of points in the opposite direction. That we are not sort of our nature, the evolutionary history out of which we come, is one where people had a lot of different partners, and so actually enforcing, especially lifelong monogamy, is quite contrary. And again, the Vox thing, I want to shout it out, talks about the biology and not only like genetically who we're closest to within the ape family, bonobos and chimps, but also they get down to the shapes of the penis and how the male penis in humans has a shape on it that creates a vacuum, with the idea of you're pulling sperm out, right? And the evolutionary advantage of having sex with a lot of male partners, or at least a couple male partners from the female side of it, is that the sperm compete with each other for the fittest.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's a fascinating situation, right? Because Peterson is of the anti-social engineering crowd, but this is a clear example of attempting to socially engineer
Yes.
against our biology. And I'm not
Mhm.
like, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Like, I want to have in the second part of this, right, the discussion of the ethics of all of this, right? We're just still laying out the science, so that no one accuses us of not laying out the science before we talk about the ethics. But like, let's be honest, he's for a kind of, very mild version of sexual communism, right?
Mhm.
The thing that he has sort of made fun of other people for being a fan of, right? He's sort of is laying out a method by which, not in the strict, strong way of redistribute, but in a passive cultural way, the redistribution of mates.
Another point that I just want to throw out there before I forget it is
Mhm.
that, he again has made this claim that monogamy is what civilization sort of veers to. However, if it was such a natural process, we wouldn't need all the divorce laws on the books. I mean, in the Vox video, they mentioned that 20 states, I believe, it's still illegal to commit adultery, and you can range from a fine of $10 to actual time in prison. And so we wouldn't need those laws if it was such an easy thing to do. And also this idea that civilizations tend, toward this, for a very long period of time, the Islamic world in the Middle Ages was the edge of civilization in terms of mathematics and chemistry and astronomy, and even religious tolerance. You had to pay a tax if you were not Muslim, but you were allowed to go about your life. And that was definitely not a society that was, and it's still, in theory, I think men today think that do take multiple wives. So this idea that civilization, it's bad history as well as being bad science and everything else. It's a mythical view from a sort of Judeo-Christian perspective, a modern one, of how natural marriage is supposedly meant to be, and how much of an aberration anything other than strict monogamy is, when really he's the one swimming upstream in terms of biology.
It reminds me a little bit of Confucianism sometimes. Like when he talks about order so much and the playing out of the archetypes that one has to live in order to bring harmony and order to the universe. It reminds me a lot of their stuff and the arguments between them and the Taoists, that the Confucians believe if you act out the right behaviors in the right way, it will order the universe correctly. It will bring structure to it. Whereas the Taoists believe you just got to kind of be natural, and being natural is the most functional kind of way. And I think he really has a Christian kind of view that, if you pressure people into these roles, whether it's certain gender roles or certain monogamous roles, that if you pressure them in the right ways into the right kinds of roles, a kind of orderous harmony will flow.
When I've asked his fans and defenders of enforced monogamy, because they say, oh, it's just talking about cultural and social pressures to encourage people this way, and I ask for specific examples, they don't give me any. And in one particular exchange, when I came up with an article about women in Australia who were in evangelical, very fundamentalist communities being counseled to stay in abusive marriages because marriage is, so important to God. Like, this is what you're talking about, social and cultural pressure.
Yep, even the mildest version of this is still bad. And I've had the same experience, right? Because I get a lot of messages from people who are liberals and who are fans of his. And they can't defend this. They can't say I'm for what he's describing in this scenario. So really the only arguments I've gotten are certain people took him too strongly and thought that he meant the Handmaid's Tale, and it was disingenuous to compare this to, the incels, even though I don't think it is. I think that he and the incels are addressing the same problem in their minds. They just have somewhat overlapping but slightly different methods for approaching it.
That's very, I think, spot on assessment. So did you want to move on to the ethics, or did you want to watch the video first?
Let's watch the video first.
Okay.
I think the video, it's good. It's, because like you said, his fans have struggled to answer the question, what does he really mean by this? But there is this video where he seems to sort of give an account by example, at least, of what he has in mind.
Yes, now I just have to find it. So sorry, because I changed a couple of things. Nope,
I have a link.
Oh, well, I've got my speakers on and everything set up, so I just need to go into my history to where I had it before.
Okay.
So, oh, you know what? I do have it up right there.
Great.
I just didn't see it. Okay, let me share the screen. Trying not to get stream inception, because it has this weird thing where, you get the infinite.
Yep, there it goes.
So I wasn't sure if we are going to watch this or not, so I didn't put it up on the links yet, people, but the credit goes here if you want to go watch this video for yourself, because the sound is terrible, so you might need to. You know what? If there are closed captions, no, there aren't, sadly. You can go to T, and this is the title. I'll link it later, but for those of you who want to go now. So, right, so let me just set this up a little bit. This is Dave Rubin, isn't it?
Is it or is it yeah, I think it's Dave Rubin, yeah.
Okay. And it's just a 3-minute clip from a talk where he asks Jordan Peterson about this concept of enforced monogamy. I feel like we should do no well poisoning.
No.
Okay, we're just going to play it. And then we can't interrupt, though. So if at some point you want to stop, we can stop and discuss it before we're moving on. So we don't have to watch. Actually, it'd be better that way because that's a more defensible fair use claim than if we just play it. So let's interrupt because then we can do our commentary. And if you have any problems with the sound, let me know. We did a test before, but if your side, Aaron, just let me know if you can't hear it. And I'll do what I can to drown out the crowd noise and increase the noise of the speakers.
Okay. So the question is, what do you mean by forced monogamy?
Well, we can start by what I don't mean. I don't mean taking innocent women at gunpoint and handing them over to useless men.
Okay, pause it for a second. This is going to be like a little bit of pausing. I really dislike Peterson as a communicator. I find it frustrating people claim that he is a strong communicator, given how condescending he is to people who don't necessarily immediately know a terminology from a theory that, you know, in another place in time, you know, the field of anthropology is the soft sciences, right? All of a sudden, it's like these guys are suddenly saying you should have known all of these details about a science that we have been calling feminist lies for like 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So that's a little frustrating. And I think it's annoying that he starts off by strawmanning other people. Yes, there are some people who thought he meant Handmaiden's Tale because enforced monogamy doesn't sound great. The word enforced is right out there in the front. But like, there's a whole other discussion to be had about what he actually means. But he first has to do his whole song and dance about how horribly mistreated he was. And I just find that really, really annoying. And I find that his fans just and Dave Rubin hanging on every joke, quote unquote, is a little gross to me. But okay, carry on.
Yeah, and just to come in on that as well, I mean, you're right. Yeah. By starting off with the whole, let me tell you what I didn't mean, lets him set himself up to whine the victim, right? A much classier way of dealing with this would have been to say, you know, I think that phrase caused a lot of confusion, and I didn't explain it really in the interview. And it seemed, and I would just want to apologize because a lot of people don't know this concept. So let me tell you what it is, right?
Yep.
But no, he wants to whine and whine and whine and whine, and just kind of pay attention to how much time he spends explaining the concept as to what it actually means and examples of it, and how much time he just complains about how people misrepresented him.
Yep.
So,
you know, it was very interesting to watch that unfold. What I meant was that monogamy as something that's socially valued appears to be essentially a human universal. That doesn't mean that human beings are universally monogamous.
All right. So the idea of it being a human universal, but not universally human.
I don't know what that means. I was taught by one of my favorite professors, to be honest, when one doesn't know what something means, don't try to pretend to understand it. And I don't know what he means by that. Do you?
My interpretation of it would be that if you look across human societies, they will universally be monogamous. But that doesn't mean individuals within every society will be monogamous.
Okay. So you translate it into an actual claim, but a false one.
Exactly.
Right.
We've already gone over that. Yeah.
That's a fair interpretation. I guess the other way we might steel man this is to say, for all human beings, a pair bonding situation is adaptive for children. That's a universal or something like that, right? That this provides a certain unit of stability in a universal kind of way for all human beings, I guess.
Maybe.
I mean, I'm trying to be very, very generous here.
You are. You're being very nice.
I think that's probably what he's trying to say. So, right. Hold
on. I'm going to take it. I locked it on myself, but I think I'm going to try to put you on in the corner, except now I can't figure out which button is actually the one I need to shoot because there's so many buttons to push. That's why you don't want stream inception. All right, back to the video.
We're not. be serially monogamous, and some people are players and have multiple partners and all of that, but there's a strong proclivity.
So what he was saying there, in case the audience didn't hear it, was that some people are players and some people are monogamous. So, it's not, again, kind of what I was saying about not every member in a society will be monogamous. There will be variation there, but societies, I think, are universally monogamous is something they tend to, they have with, enough to make it like a universal, which, as we said, is wrong.
Across known societies to tilt towards monogamy, and the enforcement is social norms. Like, think about it. I can't believe that I even have to say this.
I just want to say, incredulity is not an argument.
No.
And he says this, and I just want to point out, because I don't think I have yet, I've done reading a little bit about gender differences based on evolutionary psychology and for my thesis. And I had no recollection of this phrase, enforced monogamy.
It's not actually that common. Heinrich doesn't use it in his book either. He talks about pair bonding and socially pressured monogamy, basically. But I know this is not a universal term of art. I think you could find it if you can Google it. But again, I was lucky that I had been in that class. I wouldn't necessarily have jumped to immediately all of that data. And I think it's wrong of him to make fun of people who didn't have any idea what he was talking about here.
I did Google it. I actually, and I found a lot of articles about Jordan Peterson using the phrase. But when I Googled, I was like, okay, I'll just start with the basics and then I'll get the references and move on. Enforced monogamy, Wikipedia, nothing.
Really? All right. So it's really, really, really not a term of art. I just assumed that it was like maybe a specialized by one particular individual, but that's interesting.
It might be, but it might be so specialized within a niche of anthropology that it even it has, nobody's thought about putting an entry. Well, they will now. They'll use Jordan Peterson as their sword.
And let's discuss this as a term of art for a second. It's not very precise.
No.
It should be culturally enforced monogamy or government enforced monogamy, some sort of clarifier about what you mean by enforced. If he had provided that, that would have solved the whole problem, it seems like.
Right. And within the abstract of the article he posted on Twitter that used the phrase, it talked about social and cultural, basically ways of inculcating monogamy. So it didn't have to be political per se, but it could be something like an example I used in my hangout with the happy hour with Kevin about we do have a society, we can look at India, where marriages are arranged, marriage is accepted, marriage is very much the norm. People who don't get married are very deviant in ways that in the West, like you can be single and live comfortably. I think you get a lot more pressure in India, especially from any family members. And there is a very big problem with domestic abuse. And because marriage is placed so highly, victims of domestic abuse and children are, you're supposed to stay married. So if your husband's beating you, you have to take it. You have to save your marriage.
Yeah, and someone at one point was like, "Can you find me proof where Jordan Peterson is arguing in favor of marital rape?" And it's like, no, I can't find him saying those words. What I can show you is that what he's arguing for leads there. Leads there historically and will lead there again.
Wow, a straw man. They just must have, I don't understand how the Haymarket isn't doing more robustly, I have to say, with all the Peterson fans coming on board. All right, back to the talk.
Your son just gets married and he comes home and he says, "Guess what, Dad? I've been screwing around." And what do? You pat him on the head and you say, "Hey, good work, kid. That's my young man."
So that's his understanding of enforced monogamy. It's the fact that your child, you wouldn't congratulate your child who got married for sleeping around. And he's about to go into the fact that your kid doesn't tell you that he's doing that because he's ashamed. And shame, apparently, is one of the factors that he's now citing in a roundabout way as a way to enforce monogamy. He wants a shame society, basically, where everybody forces everybody else to live according to a set of rules that no one particular person, agrees with 100%, maybe.
I love how optimistic he is about this too, right? Like, let's be honest about enforced monogamy. In the cultures where we have it, it's almost universal for the women, but the pressures towards men are only in about a quarter of the societies, it seems like. Often men are pretty much allowed, if not encouraged, or at least a blind eye is turned towards them being, you know, stepping out basically. And
Yeah.
like 50 years ago, if you came home to your father and said, you know, hey, I'm getting a little bit from the secretary on the side, you know, you might get a like, oh, you know, don't get yourself in trouble kind of slap on the wrist kind of thing. Like, there was very much more of like, he wants to go back to a culture where that would probably be swept under the rug, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So
Would
I
have
don't,
the appearance of monogamy.
yeah. I mean, like, maybe he's trying to argue for some new progressive version of culturally enforced monogamy, but I think when you pair this together with all of his anti-feminist work, it's pretty obvious that he thinks that we've gone astray and we need to come back. And we'll see that in the video, so I don't want to jump ahead.
The other sort of juxtaposition here is that you're right, in these cultures of enforced monogamy, men are much more free, not only in terms of their interpersonal relationships and judgment and societal judgments, but, you know, even industries, whether it's sex strip bars or prostitution, that cater to non-monogamy, or at least, you know, sex outside of marriage. And yet enforced monogamy, as you sort of point out, falls harder on women than men. So it is, you know, I think it was Dan Savage who said, you know, if you look at the scale of fidelity, and it's like the least that gay men are very likely to cheat on each other, then it's heterosexual men and women are the next most likely, and then the least likely are lesbian couples. So he said the problem with monogamy is dicks. That's, you know, so yeah, and so you get, but then again, where do the punitive measures fall? It's not on men.
Yeah, no, I want to really highlight that. I think an important historical takeaway, what we should not forget, is that the people who pay the price for this are some men and all the women. Like, the women are, it falls much more heavily on women in terms of, think about what we're describing historically. You're taking men who are aggressive and violent, and you're forcing a woman to, you know, through culture, forcing them to try to domesticate that man for the sake of society. She then is responsible for making sure that he isn't violent and abusive, and in turn often suffers the sort of the splash of that kind of behavior, right? So in individuals where it isn't completely removed, it's most likely going to land on the wife.
And this is why a lot of what Peterson says ends up being misogynistic, even though it doesn't necessarily appear so from the language he's using. When you unpack the implications of what the concepts he's connecting, it's the inevitable conclusion.
Yep. Yeah, he doesn't seem really interested in solving the problem of men who can't find physical intimacy by strongly encouraging gay marriage, I've noticed. No. Maybe I missed that video, but it seems like there's interesting anthropological data that suggests that one reason that homosexuality emerges is a way to solve the problem of surplus males. So I don't understand why he's not really more on board with that.
Yeah, I mean, if it works biologically in one direction, right? If the science, and this is another thing, you know, you think by claiming, okay, so let me back up a little bit. I read an article in The Guardian, which I was hoping would be longer, but it was much shorter, and less interesting than I was hoping based on the title. But one of the things that the author did include was she quoted Peterson complaining about the reaction he got, and him making an appeal that he's just stating a scientific fact. This is somehow a scientific truth. Right. It's just an idea. We can't go back in time and conduct studies on agricultural versus hunter-gatherer societies and look at how they, whether or not male violence was even on their minds when they started to culturally shift toward monogamy, or whether there were better explanations like agriculture and the things that then produced, like the kind of reproductive pressures that led to. You know, so yeah, just as him claiming this concept as a scientific truth is just really, really terrible sciencing.
Yeah. And I hate I'm just stating a fact, because you're not. You're inferring ethical claims, and like, own the fact that you are inferring ethical claims. We'll see it in this video. It's right there.
Right. All right. So let's keep going.
Well, no, you're not happy about it. And he doesn't tell you because he knows you're not going to be happy about it. And that's enforced monogamy. It's part of the social structure. It's like, what else is enforced monogamy? It's like, well, most people want a monogamous relationship. And if they enter into a relationship with someone, they're not happy if that person goes and sleeps around, right?
Okay, so now enforced monogamy is not social or cultural pressures. It's basically jealousy.
Yeah, so this is the weird, like, jumping around, right? Earlier, we made very clear he's clearly trying to do a cultural engineering thing, but now he also wants to claim that this is biologically natural because of jealousy, basically.
Yeah, and it's not at all consistent with other things he said or the papers he's produced.
No.
In terms of an example.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Oh, this is so easy.
Yeah, no, it's great. I like this video. It really lays it all out beautifully.
Right? Most of you would be happy if that happened. It's like not being happy.
No, I have to go. Okay.
That's part of enforced monogamy. It's part of this. And you might have noticed, you probably did, polygamy is actually illegal. You can't have multiple marital partners.
Okay, but yeah, you want to take that one? You start.
This is where the rubber really meets the road, right? Because he spent so much time, and his fans spent so much time making fun of everyone for, like, he's not being authoritarian, and his response thing that he put out was all like, you know, I'm not saying we have to do this or don't do that kind of thing. But here, one of the key examples he gives is government enforced not polygamy. That is a form of authoritarian invasion into individuals' personal lives. And I'll be honest, I know some people who are polyamorous and who might like to be able to, you know, put that into writing for the sake of their children or something. And I think that it's a little, I think, and I don't really know any, there's one argument, right? The only argument for liberals to make is that historically polygamy is used as a form of abuse, and that if you make it legal, religious organizations will use it as a form of abuse again. And that is a concern, but I think we're coming around to the fact that we're going to have to address that abuse as abuse and not criminalize consensual behavior amongst adults for the sake of trying to avoid that abuse by extension.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of polygamy, I'm basically very similar to what you've just stated. I don't have a problem with the concept when it involves consenting adults. Yeah. It doesn't affect me. I don't be single, be married, whatever. Are you happy? Great, go do your thing. But when it is used, as you say, to especially exploit girls, and also, you know, when kids are married very young as well, a combination of very low age of consent for marriage laws when you have a parent like 13.
Yep.
Plus these sort of religious fundamentalism with males at the top or men at the top who are powerful and basically engaging in the kind of behavior that Peterson says doesn't happen in civilizations.
Yeah, it's interesting that he leaves out things like child brides and other forms of culturally enforced marriage in this particular scenario. I mean, it's like, you know, because he didn't necessarily clarify it very well originally, I think it's understandable that people thought, well, what does he mean according, you know, along this wide potential range of options?
Yeah, because there's no, you know, again, when his reaction was to just be indignant, like, how do you guys not know what this means? Yeah, all he had to do was issue an explanation or cite some kind of definition in a book we could all go look at, or some more papers or whatever, but it's not how we handle it.
And his explanation, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit, hopefully, is it didn't help in the sense that he got all mealy-mouthed about any of the conclusions of what he was trying to say in all of this, and sort of backed away from it and only wanted to talk about a very narrow discussion of the science, kind of like certain other individuals, I suppose, that we know about. You know, this is a reoccurring theme, and I think Vox was even that same Vox they were pointing out in the intellectual dark web episode that this is a common refrain with these guys where they will state mixed factual truths combined with really problematic ethical claims. And when you question the ethical claims, they argue like you are only attacking the limited subset of the factual claims that they can put studies up for.
Yep. So before, was that your end point, or did you want to?
No, go ahead. I was going to say maybe we should look at the end of this one.
Yeah, so I was going to say, before we continue, I just want to review what we've gotten so far, which is shame, jealousy, and laws. These are our 3 ways of socially enforcing monogamy.
Wonderfully summarized.
Partners simultaneously. That's enforced monogamy. It's like And it's an anthropological term, and it's been known for 100 years by anthropologists, most of whom are left-leaning, by the way, because that's how it goes.
What?
He couldn't get a chance not to take a little bit of a dig at the fact that all these anthropologists who he's citing are dirty cultural Marxists, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We got to remember this is all BS right up until the moment where it supports his views on this.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was like, I totally agree with this, except it's come up by those dirty commies,
Right.
But yes, and so it can't be a bad concept because people I think are left wing occasionally use this, but not. Right. But yeah, 100 years. I don't know if we have a fact check on when forced monogamy first appeared, but I think he's over egging the pudding a bit on this.
Then monogamous social structures are one of the ways that you keep children raised properly so that they have a relatively stable environment, and then you keep male aggression, especially the aggression of young men, under some degree of social control.
Okay, so again, what we talked about earlier, anthropologically, you saw the notion, and going back to the 17th century, we saw it with Native American hunter-gathering tribe, one at least, as related by a French explorer. The idea that a child belongs to the tribe. So if a child is crying next to you, you just pick up that child and you comfort it. You don't go, hey, your kid over here, right? Yep. They belong to they're a tribe. They're all together. They're a family, right?
There's no way, daylight that I can see between this argument and the argument made in the 80s and 90s against single mothers. Mm-hmm. What's the difference, right? It's the same argument that's been made against gay marriage and adoption. Like, he's just a conservative. There's no magic here. There's no secret. He's just a conservative who's read a bit of anthropology and way too much young.
Oh, that should be a meme. Like on the cover of his book, and just put like underneath.
I know I saw some emmeticists who might be able to get a hold of that for you.
Okay. I'll put that. I'll share that on Twitter if you get that to me. All right, we've got like another less than a minute left. Whew.
It's not a mystery. The fact that I got in trouble for that is kind of a miracle. It's like, well, don't you notice that we enforce monogamy in like almost every way? And the same thing happens all over the world in all sorts of diverse societies.
Sorry, but if we're already enforcing monogamy in so many different ways, why are we having this problem?
Yes, that's the incoherent part of his clarification. He seems to be now saying what I meant by enforced monogamy was the thing we are already doing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Which doesn't really help with the incel situation. And look, the reality is, I think what he really wants to say is it was the thing that we used to be doing and have stopped doing because of the feminists and the social justice warriors and all those sorts of individuals, and that like we've lost these essential archetypal roles that will allow us to avoid slipping into chaos.
Yeah, and if anything, well, no, I'm not going to get off on a tangent. Sorry, we'll stay focused on this. So, okay, well, let's see if we can wrap this up.
Yeah.
And then when we deviate from that there's a price to be paid. So that's why, like, I'm a New York Times pariah, is because I think that monogamy, all things considered, is a good idea.
And that's not what he said.
No. But it's a good clarification, right? It's the closest he gets to admitting that he is not just making an is claim, but an ought claim, that there is a price to be paid for human well-being if you abandon these principles, and therefore one ought not to abandon these principles.
And what is his solution? Shame, jealousy, and government interference.
Yeah. That's what he thinks has historically been the solution. And I think his view is we need to just go back to that solution.
That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah. And that I think is the most mild Steel Manning version that we can make. And it's still immoral. It's still wrong.
As you said, he's just a conservative. He's just a conservative who dresses it up in Evo Psych instead of the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like, he uses the Bible in metaphorical kinds of ways. And I think for him, he sees all of that stuff as real. He says, right, this is real in a real important kind of way. That's why it again reminded me of the Confucianism when he talks about like the dragons and the bog witches all being real and stuff. It's like he thinks that the descriptions and the structural metaphors shape reality. And there is some interesting cultural descriptions. There's interesting cultural work about how our archetypes and our ways of seeing the world do shape our reality, but they don't prevent order. They don't provide order and avoid chaos merely by, putting on these pantomime costumes and playing out these roles.
I would definitely say that archetypes and cultural frameworks, all of that certainly guides our energy and the way that we think about the world, right? I mean, it's just it's necessary. It's as necessary as sort of like the fact that our bodies will predetermine how we experience the color spectrum. It's just, that's the way it is. And when you're born into that culture, you have these cultural frameworks. If you're not exposed to something, you can't think about it, right? You have to or find your way to it. But these aren't immutable. They
Right.
were made up by people. And if anything, they're probably outdated. They're probably holding us back. There's probably, while some wisdom in there, a lot of things that don't apply to the 21st century anymore. And understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe and the nature of the universe and the nature of ourselves, both as, physical and the mystery of consciousness, right? Those archetypes that, might have been very important to the cultures that created them shouldn't define what our cultural limits are anymore.
And the anthropology doesn't support conservatism. Like, when you look at how cultural evolution overtook genetic evolution as a faster means to adapt and survive within rapidly changing environments, you're talking about a progressive cultural model from the get-go. You're talking about a system that takes on new ideas, combines them together, adapts rapidly and quickly to changing situations. And there's nothing more rapidly changing than our current environment. Like, the amount of technological shift that we've experienced, the amount of information that we are confronted with compared to one generation ago is insane. And so it's insane, I think, to think that we can go back to a old world kind of model. What we need is to figure out new healthy ways for individuals to have relationships, and for individuals to continue to find the kind of intimacy they need in an increasingly technologically, estranged society. But the answer is not any form of what do you say, shaming and threatening and laws.
Yes, I mean, when it's just kind of, I'm a bit baffled when he can lay out the consequences of notions of masculinity that deal with emotional suppression, with humiliation, with having boys have to constantly demonstrate their masculinity, their man, to continue being accepted, and all the pressures that our current society puts on boys and young men. And his answer is throw sex at them.
Well, and it's weird. It's not even throw sex at them, right? Because he doesn't explicitly say, and then people will be having more sex. It's throw monogamy at them, with the implication being either all of the sex that goes along with that monogamy will be consensual, or we as a society will treat it as consensual, which is the much more likely darker version. And this is a situation where I think we can point out that there's a weird divergence between him and the incels, because a fair number of the incels are against enforced monogamy because they see it as a trap, that it traps men into taking care of a woman who still won't sleep with him anyway. So they're more sympathetic to more extreme things, or they're more sympathetic to things that don't involve consent, like prostitution and sex bots and raping people. They're pro-raping people, which is, as hate cults go, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, just I always think that I've kind of reached the bottom, the darkest part of the incel community, and then I'll talk to somebody else who's been digging around in it, and like, oh no, that's way darker. That's I haven't hit bottom yet, have I?
Can I share the darkest one that I found,
right.
or that we found? This is going to ruin all your audience members. The most horrifying one that I found was they use rape as a way to get back at the normies, as a way to get back at people who they think are responsible for their situation. And so one guy was arguing the best solution is to rape someone and then throw acid on them. They're big on acid attacks too. So they combine rape and then acid, because then no one will ever want to sleep with that person again, simultaneously hurting them and proving the incel's point that it's all about appearances.
Basically, they're terrorists. I mean, that's a terrorist attack there.
Yeah, they're terrorists for sure.
Like radicalized sort of.
Yeah, scary radicalized young men with a lot of anger.
Well, let's finish listening to one of the guys they look up to, and then I can put my avatar back on. Oh, is that just 6 seconds
maybe
of applause?
Yeah, I think it's just a bunch of applause.
Blew everybody's ears out for
Oh well.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's a great little clip, right? The question is direct, the answer is sufficiently direct, and it doesn't make things better.
Oh, no. No, I mean, if anything, it undermines what he said before in his various claims in the past. So yeah, he clearly doesn't understand the concept himself. I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
And instead of looking it up, he's just been bullshitting through it, his way through it.
My understanding is that, I mean, this is a common thing for him, and I'm sympathetic as someone who tries to speak on a variety of subjects that I'm not a full-on expert on. I've studied them, I've tried to learn about them, but it's hard to be an expert in anything at this point, especially multiple fields of anything. But the condescension with which he approaches it, and the assumption that what little bit he has gleaned of this material is the 100% truth, and anyone who argues otherwise is doing so in bad faith, it's just so frustrating.
And the fact that, as you say, he does it in a tone that's very patronizing. He also spends a lot of time playing the victim. And as we said before, the things that he talks about in his explanation don't fit within, well, I guess unless you want to say socially, like we have a society of shame or culture of shame or culture of jealousy. And these are the ways that we solve the problem with more poison. It boggles the mind to me that he hadn't prepared something to say. He hadn't had done some research and was going to quote somebody else, right? To have examples to hand. He just whined and waffled, and it was
yeah. I find it, it's frustrating, and it's dangerous, right? So I mean, my background is in ethics, and so the reason this matters to me is how this plays out for human beings treating other human beings. And the scary thing is he's continuing to scapegoat the liberal feminist left, I think, who are the people who have undermined various forms of enforced monogamy within our society, right? That's what we have seen over the past 50 years. Women are allowed to get divorced now. Single mothers are allowed to exist now with a little bit less shame. There's still quite a lot of shame. I'm not saying we've fixed any of these things, but the trend lines have been in that direction. And I think he really wants to say, because of that, we have, terrorist attacks by incels. And if we would just give up on this horrible project of trying to treat everyone equally, then we would stop getting attacked.
Yeah, if we just, repress the women more, the men will get in line.
Oh my God. Now,
you mentioned ethics, and I'm glad you did, because I was wondering if you wanted to, for the benefit of our listeners, watchers in this case, kind of enumerate the ethical concerns or transgressions that you've identified or can think of, at least off the top of your head, since I didn't ask you to prep this beforehand.
Oh, sure.
And just kind of give an ethicist's take on this event.
Yeah, so I think it's funny because he's making a very utilitarian kind of argument, right? He's sort of going against deontology, which has been tricky, I think, because these guys are all about personal freedom most of the time. And as the article pointed out, Peterson kind of has to admit that this is the kind of situation where he's not actually for deontological kind of autonomy. And he wants people to feel pressured by society to conform to a certain model because it will produce the best consequences. This is pretty straight consequentialism, right? He's saying if you don't do these things, there will be more unrest and violence and unhappy people. I think he's wrong even by utilitarian grounds. I think you can see that there is a correlation between quality of life and increased access to personal autonomy, birth control, all these kinds of the feminist revolution stuff that is generally cited as being responsible for these shifts with regard to enforced monogamy. So yeah, I don't think there's any ethical argument for him to stand on unless you make a very strict kind of stability argument, right? If he really wanted to say every other model is going to lead to societal collapse in the next 10 years, except for my model, then, like that's his very extreme version of the kind of utilitarian argument that I think he is somewhat sympathetic to. I certainly think that he thinks that if we continue the way we're going, it'll get worse.
Yes, which, apocalypticists always do.
Yeah, and he's got a very naive kind of absolutism about it, right? The same way that he can't really understand that there might be multiple cultural right answers to this problem evolutionarily. He also doesn't really consider, even it seems like, that there could be multiple ethical answers to this in terms of different cultures. That there could be cultures that might promote pair bonding in the sense of long-term relationships, but don't, like I said, promote monogamy, for example, and that could allow for access to some of the stability that pair bonding gets without violating the consent and the preferences of individuals who don't want to be shoehorned into those lifestyles.
So should we talk a little bit about sexual communism to wrap up the...
Sexual communism versus sexual liberalism, right? He's against liberalism.
I think Dusty Smith called it sexual Marxism, but as a sort of play on cultural Marxism. But it's an issue of sort of, as you pointed out before, the whatever you described when you were talking about his rationale about liberties and societies and stuff. This is pretty much the logic of C16. He's taking the logic of C16 and just applying it to the thing he wants to apply it to.
Sure. Identity politics is great when you apply it to your group.
But as the article pointed out, and he acknowledged, this sort of, it's basically a redistribution. You're trying to redistribute, intercourse, but within a moral framework of monogamy.
Yeah, it's a very passive kind of redistribution, like we've said, right? It's not, like he said, it's not holding a gun to the woman's head, but it is, it's not that different if you are a family that says, if you get divorced, we will disown you and you will have no money and you will be destitute. That is holding a kind of gun to someone's head. And I don't think that's very far off from what he has in mind. I don't have any evidence to suggest otherwise. At least he has, in his multiple attempts to clarify, he hasn't said what it is really that he is strongly for, except for it seems like he's for banning polygamy and pressuring your children into being healthy monogamous individuals.
Well, there certainly is a danger in relying on jealousy to keep people monogamous, which is one thing that he cited as a social norm that is useful and good. And it's precisely that kind of possessive behavior that is displayed in very, violent, abusive relationships.
And I feel like, like we talked about how malleable this stuff actually is. I think jealousy is one of those things that could be very easily sort of shifted within human cultural consciousness over a generation or two, that you could get people who were much less prone to violence. And as you move away from like honor cultures, for example, right, you get people who are much more able to address their feelings of jealousy in thoughtful and mindful kinds of ways rather than going into a blind rage.
And certainly we don't have any role models for that. I mean, if you look at media, since we've had films, we've only had one narrative, really, for most of it. And recently that's been changing. Excuse me. But yeah, if we had positive, media role models or fiction where people were confronting these issues and dealing with it, then you could see different ways of handling it. You could see healthy ways of dealing with feelings of jealousy and unpacking what the jealousy is really about and getting to the heart of it rather than saying, I'm just a jealous person.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why so many individuals who were a second ago on board with the freedom to experiment are suddenly enamored by the idea of, pressuring individuals. And like, I guess maybe in their defense, we might say they're not enamored by it. They're just enamored by the individual who's making this particular bad argument. And so they're stuck a little bit tribally for themselves, having to find any way they can to defend this. It makes me really nervous, though, that like, in my experience, Peterson fans always put the onus of blame on someone else for the lack of communication. He is never responsible for the misunderstanding.
It kind of, to me, sounds, and very ironically, in a stereotype of someone who's a big fan of Derrida. When people who don't get Derrida like say, I can't read him, he's incomprehensible. And you're like, you're just not reading him right. You have to go back and you have to read Heidegger and you have to read this person and that person, and then you'll understand Derrida. And I feel, I mean, and that's actually really mean to Derrida fans, because I don't think they're like that. But that's a sort of stereotype of a cabal with such that uses obfuscatory language rather than making an effort to clarify. In fact, that is the argument that sort of my PhD super would use against, sort of like, Hegelians and the people who logical positivists were reacting against. And yet it's the Peterson fan who tries to mimic his mentor by using the full 280 characters. Managing to say nothing that is, you could boil it down to just a sentence. They've taken 180 characters to say basically nothing. It's an evasion. It's not an answer.
Yeah, and I think he tends to, be very evasive. And I think it's because his stuff wasn't selling as much when he was less evasive and less controversial, because he was more sort of just bland conservatism. And if he were to sort of unpack this stuff instead of like this whole will he, won't he, what does he really mean kind of energy around it, it would kind of fade into the background. And I really do think he ends up as someone like Ann Coulter, who continues to just sort of complain about how current society is harming individuals by, giving them these kinds of freedoms, while society will continue to adapt to the pressures of what individuals actually need.
When Jordan Peterson says things like, monogamy is a human universal, he's just being wrong. I mean, I think this, when he talks, a lot of times he talks about things he doesn't know very well. And so he talks about them in very vague ways, which allows people to read in a lot of different things and to try to defend him by giving different readings. And they can put it on this very vague language because he doesn't have a clear concept of what enforced monogamy is in his head. Right? But he still, for some reason, feels like he should keep talking. And when I feel like I could get called up on something, or I'll preface this by saying I think this is the case, but if I'm wrong, let me know. But he doesn't seem to have that sense of restraint that I see a lot of academics, make, because so often in peer review and so often when we present to each other, we make the most conservative claim. Then we make the claim that has the most evidence backing it. That is the most plausible based on the observations. We don't waffle on fancifully about how DNA structure can be found in ancient Egyptian art to our colleagues.
I mean, imagine if he had said encouraged monogamy instead of enforced monogamy.
Oh, it would have made all the difference in the world.
Because no one would have cared.
No.
And it would have just been, oh, right, see, he's kind of straight line conservative. Another thing I would point out is that, like, this is immoral because it, like I was saying, it continues to scapegoat the wrong people. Like, if we want to talk about how you would encourage monogamy or encourage functional pair bonding in the modern world, I think that's a really great discussion to have, to talk about learning and modeling health, like you were saying, having role models who show healthy relationships and show how to work through complicated relationship problems to other individuals. That could be very valuable. I think what else sort of things that we could do? I had another one and I lost it. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. No, I didn't have another one. So
oh no,
you're hitting it over to me and I'm just going, ugh.
No, okay. Sorry. I'm just trying to think of the other kinds of things that we can do. Like we were saying, downplaying jealousy, playing up communication. Another thing that's really weird about all of this is that, again, when you start to look at encouraged monogamy, you're looking at the same things that the incels and the MRA guys have called feminizing. You're describing essentially the same mechanisms of feminizing, getting the men to be more communicative with their partners. The fact, I mean, the reality is this was all a mechanism by evolution to create more emotional investment from men, right? We've essentially been feminizing men for 4 million years or something.
And that's a really scary thought to them for some reason. I guess healthy communications and
Yeah.
and having an understanding of your emotional reactions and being able to process them in a way that's not self-destructive or hurts other people apparently is an attack on masculinity.
Yeah, I'm all for, people who want to claim that they are masculine. I'm all for them claiming that while doing whatever they want pretty much, because I don't think there's any essential features that really attach to masculinity or femininity.
Yeah.
I think they're entirely artificial, and so anyone can claim to be masculine and have whatever presentation or features or whatever they prefer.
Agreed.
So I think that's another way in which Peterson's ethics is fundamentally flawed. He thinks that we have to limit that kind of diversity down to a couple of archetypal structures, whereas, again, just classical liberals here just kind of think that if you let people live out lives where they are allowing, you're promoting consent. That's another key thing, right? You're promoting that as long as there is consent and open communication within the relationship, people can try a bunch of different stuff and see what works for them.
Now, are we pretty much to the wrap up?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, because a couple things then that I wanted to bring up is because I only watched part of it because I had other videos to watch in preparation for this. But you watched the Sargon video?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So, because I'm curious now, because we've had this whole long talk, we watched the video together. We've had some really great unpacking of how deceptive this is, or Peterson was in terms of the way that he's been presenting that. I think has been quite deceptive because he keeps wanting to play like a shell game with the ball in terms of what he really means. And my understanding from just the first part of it is that Sargon is sort of sympathetic to Peterson, but really he should be against, if he's a liberalist, then any attempt to sort of like bully people or force people into a certain thing, surely that is a violation of your rights to be who you want to be. So I'm just kind of curious as to what he said, if you can kind of remember any highlights.
Yeah, so I mean, he does at one point, he said specifically that he thought it was Peterson's responsibility for having clarified it and for having should know, like I said, this is a common thing you see with professors on all sides, where the professor will say something that is technical and it gets misunderstood by the layman culture. It happens a lot with like Peter Singer, for example, on the left. So, he did hold Peterson a little bit accountable for that, but then I think went on to mostly just blame the left for not then figuring out what he meant anyway.
We're supposed to read his mind.
Yeah, it comes back to the whole thing where ultimately it's other people's fault to fill in the problem. It's other people's jobs to fill in the gaps, which I find really frustrating, because while I do try to steelman Peterson, it becomes a problem because anytime I try to steelman him, I have to fill in those gaps. And when I fill them in with stuff like he clearly is for conservative versions of enforced monogamy that lead to things like higher rates of spousal abuse, they will always be able to say, well, he didn't explicitly say that one thing, so you're clearly going above and beyond his claims.
Oh, wow. It's interesting now because I'm starting to see more of the YouTube former skeptic community, not really like the old skeptic community, but I'm starting to see more people putting up Peterson videos. And it's starting to feel more like who was that, Hovind, when he was trying to science a bit more. Like people are coming at it like we are, which is you look at what can be substantiated in literature and how the concept is being used as far as, we are able to observe and then compare it to him and break it all down. And I think it's good to see. I think there's a lot of, it's kind of the 21st century version of woo-woo,
Yeah, and it's not doing well, as you've noticed, when it's come into confrontation with sort of people who are experts in these various fields, much like I feel like, with Harris and Murray, for example, that Harris got a little bit out of his depth and it resulted in him getting sort of smacked down a little bit by people who actually knew more about the subject. I think, Peterson, we all sort of rise to the level of our own incompetence, right? That's the old sort of joke. And he has gotten enough attention now that more people are pointing out, hey, you're getting a lot of this wrong.
Mhm.
Right. So there was a really wonderful thread on Twitter that was like, so apparently Jordan Peterson thinks a bunch of things about crustacean hierarchies. Well, it turns out I'm an expert on crustacean hierarchies, and here's how he's wrong about all of these things. You know, so it's fun to watch that happen. I agree, and I think it's great, and I like to try to lend the ethical philosophical part to that when I can. I think it is sad that there is this sort of narrative within within secularism that has formed, that there are these secret claims that no one's allowed to say anymore, and therefore anyone who's making controversial claims must be speaking truth to liberal power. I mean, like, that was really sort of came through to me with Harris's accounts of how he found Murray's work and then found the responses to it, and immediately identified with it the same way he had with his own experiences. I think what you're seeing is a lot of people who probably wouldn't care that much about Peterson at all if he were just talking on about the Jungian stuff. There'd be some people, certainly I've met some of them, but like, he didn't get attention until he sort of wildly misrepresented liberal orthodoxy, basically.
Yeah. And then just has been trying to ride that wave, and he's finally gotten enough to, time on the top of that wave to get a lot of attention and turn a lot of heads of people who aren't paying for his lifestyle.
And I know it doesn't mean anything, because his fans will say, oh, well, they're all just liberal academics. But like, when I mention in philosophical departments,
Rule 9, bucko.
Oh, yeah, right. They don't, other philosophers just sort of laugh. Like, I'll be honest, he's not taken super serial.
Yeah.
But I do think that he's having an impact on culture, which is why it's important to talk about this, because there's a trickle-down effect from his claims to men who I talk to who think really that they have been given a bum deal by liberal feminists, that those are the people who are to blame for what are genuine problems that men face in the world today.
Yeah, and they're not going to fix their problems by blaming feminists, because feminists aren't actually the cause of the problems, right? But yeah.
And they'll continue to blame them, and then some of them will get bored and wander on to the next thing, and other ones will, continue to cherry pick whatever examples they need to reinforce this narrative for as long as they want.
And others will descend into incel culture.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully we can continue to slowly make progress within the culture war in terms of helping men to feel their feelings and express their feelings and talk about those feelings in healthy ways, and helping men and women to feel comfortable saying, I am not interested in the patriarchally reinforced, like you have said, culturally enforced monogamous system. I want more from life, and we live in the future. We live in the really advanced world where we can ask for more, because we don't need to survive on the farm by, having this monogamous relationship and 12 children.
Right. We've moved beyond that economically, technologically, socially, and politically. So we shouldn't live like we're still trapped in that time. Yeah.
A key feature of evolutionary psych and evolution in general is that things that used to be adaptive can become maladaptive. And if you continue to, this is why conservatism struggles, is because it conflates the fact that something has been around for a long time with the idea that it will always be a good thing to do, rather than the fact that things that have been around for a long time might suddenly no longer be adaptive.
Right. It's time to just bin it and get something new. Like, it's worked for a while. It was great while it did, but now time to let it go. Yep. Before we go, you have the chat open. I don't know if you want to take just a few minutes to scroll up and down. I see that we've got 65 viewers, so there might have been more activity in the chat than when I should also say, and I'll just do this as filler because people might start typing now that I've said it.
Can you relink me first the chat, so since I got off on the wrong thing on the beginning?
That's right. You're blah. Okay, you know what? I think I can do it myself. Can you waffle on? Hey, why don't you talk about your podcast?
Sure. So this is our attempt at a little bit of podcast YouTuber cross-pollination.
Yeah.
So I do two philosophical educational podcasts of slightly different flavors. One is called Embrace the Void, which is about accepting and making peace and dealing with the fact that we live in this really horrible timeline and helping ourselves and others to find community and find different philosophical ways of understanding this world so that we can get through it while not gaslighting ourselves about the reality and the struggles that we are currently living through. So it's a fun show. It's very upbeat. Like I said, we did episodes on the incels. That I would really recommend people check out our 3-parter, 2 of which are on Embrace the Void, and another which was on She Talks Atheism with our friend Bethany Futrell, who was our guest for those episodes. And then my other podcast with Thomas Smith, who I believe you're well versed with, is Philosophers in Space, where
Yay, Thomas. And you. Yeah, that's great.
Right. Yay, Thomas. No, you're right. That's the right way to think. We take, because this arose from Thomas and I messaging each other all the time about science fiction and pop culture and being like, oh man, what about these ideas? And finally we're like, we should really just do a podcast about this. So we did a podcast about this, which is super original, right? 2 white guys doing a podcast together, where we take a certain piece of science fiction every week and a certain piece of philosophy every week and combine them together. So we use Futurama to talk about the ship of Theseus, for example, or we use Data and Star Trek to talk about artificial personhood. We've looked at Westworld. We're sort of trying to get through a bunch of different shows, and then we're going to start looping back around to a couple of shows. And it's certainly more sort of fun, lighthearted. It's really a way to try to make something like philosophy that I think a lot of people think of as very dry and inaccessible, make it interesting and enjoyable for everybody, so that you don't have to read, because a lot of the philosophy reading is just it's really dry. Even the stuff that isn't the postmodernist Derrida, incomprehensible, is still very, very turgid. So my work as a teacher has always been centered around making things accessible. So I have tried to create some podcasts to make these kinds of ideas accessible.
I think that's fantastic. I think that's the greatest thing that the sort of internet has done for the world. It has allowed people with specialist knowledge to just kind of share that with the world. And it's really phenomenal if you think about it.
I'm so lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, like, because I don't love writing, and I don't think anyone loves writing except for a couple of people like Philip K. Dick who are obsessed with it. But like, a lot of people struggle with writing, but I struggle with it because I don't experience that the things that get read a lot, that people aren't reading this academic material. So I feel like there's a huge need for people who can read that material and then translate it into formats that are accessible for people who will never be able to sit down and read that.
Right. And a lot of times it's behind paywalls anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
But you're right. I think, I understand where you're coming from, because, I do my academic writing, and I actually just finished a piece. I felt really good about it. And it was a rare occasion where, even though it was painful, I actually was sort of enjoying the process of writing, because writing is always painful. But it's how you have to write in order to get published academically. It's so precise in terms of the way you have to set it up, and how the order in which you present information, and even the way the information is presented to the eye, word counts, all of these sort of pressures. It's kind of like, when I can't remember the particular, if it's a fugue or whatever else in Baroque period, where you would have all of these different notes playing off of each other, all the rules about how the music has to follow, or the rules of music. And academic writing is very parsimonious. It can be very elegant, and it can be really nice to read, well written, efficient research. It can actually be a joy. But to do something like podcasting or YouTubing, when you have the same ideas, but you can present them in a much more casual way, and you can also, you speak to an audience that you don't assume has the information, right? So then it's sort of the challenge of, how do I present this concept? How do I understand it? How do other people understand it? And it keeps, one engaged, I think, with the field, with the ideas, and also to bring other people in and be a bridge in that world. Sorry, I kind of went off on a bit of a rant.
That's great. I mean, my specialization is in ethics and meta-ethics, and my focus is always in coming back around to the applied ethics side of things, because I really think, you don't want to be doing philosophy up in the air and not on the ground where people need it. So like we've done here, where it's always coming back to what does this mean for real people leading real lives, not just anthropologically, what did people do at various points over history, but like, what is it really going to mean on the ground when you start enforcing monogamy? So
I will just say,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was gonna say I really appreciate that you've had me on to talk about this. Did you find anything interesting in the
I didn't.
questions? Okay, no problem.
People in the chat were useless, you guys.
No.
No, they were having their own conversations. But then again, I don't really. Got some people to wrench. So a shout out there to Leto and to Adam and Kevin. I see other people too who stopped by. But yeah, I don't really train my people in the chat to do a lot of questions because mostly Kevin and I ignore them. And so it's really unfair for me to go, okay, now do you have questions? And like everyone's like, he didn't tell us we were going to be questions. We've been having a different conversation. We've been passing notes in the back of the class. So,
that I'm used to.
Yeah. So this has been really a very satisfying discussion. I'm really happy that we had the chance to do it. And also I should say, because obviously there was such a disastrous start, when initially I had Aaron just leap in and talk at length, and giving what I have to go back and listen to, I'm sure is a very excellent summary of the scientific case, or that bit. I didn't hear any of that because I had muted myself. I had gone to my initial page and I was looking at my Hangouts because I wanted to copy the title from the one that I hit incorrectly, and it was gone. Like the Hangout just disappeared. So I don't know if it was a technical issue. I don't know if I started the right one and then it got flagged down and I got kicked to this one. I don't know if I don't know what happened, but whatever it was, I've changed the name of the Hangout. We still see it as the May Hangout, but I actually changed it online. And yeah, that was kind of a weird thing on YouTube. So I will be, just in case, I don't think Jordan Peterson fans are terrible flaggers, but I'll be making a download of this immediately just as a backup. But so that was the mystery, why we had the wrong titled Hangout initially when we started this. My apologies, and if I do get to the bottom of it, I will certainly let everybody know how to avoid it in future, because there's nothing worse than going to be on a Hangout and then you end up on a completely different one. So
yeah. Well, I definitely know that there are some folks who, on my end, are excited about this chat and want to hear. So I'm glad to hear there's going to be a copy and everything.
Oh yeah, and of course you can download the audio and mirror it anywhere you'd like.
Great.
So yeah, that's we do that in our community on YouTube. It's sort of like we tend to ask, but then it's just a sort of an unspoken rule that like if you go on somebody's channel, you can mirror it back. So yeah, well, this is stuff that people on the 59 viewers don't need to hear because it's of no interest to them. Did you tell everybody where they could find you besides the link to Embrace the Void in my description box?
Yeah, so you can, iTunes / whatever, Embrace the Void or Philosophers in Space. My Twitter handle where I'm at all the time is at ETVPod, and then our other Twitter handle is at 0G Philosophy, but I'm a little bit more responsive to the ETVPod one. And then you can find our Facebook groups. We have a Philosophers in Space Facebook group that is actually a lot of fun and very active. And then I just have a ETV page that gets retweets from Twitter.
And I think officially I can say tag you're it, because now next time I'll be on the podcast, because I said when you guys invited me on, I'm like, I need to have you on my show. And now I have, so I don't know if I have to. Yes. So set that up for the future.
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Well, guys, go check out all of the stuff that Aaron just mentioned. And thank you again, Aaron. I'm sure you suggested this because it was such a good idea. I'm sure I didn't have it. So thank you for your fantastic idea. And this was, again, really enjoyable. We should do it on, a couple times a year at least, especially when there's anything interesting on Jordan Peterson, perhaps.
Yeah, so. If you ever need an ethicist, hit me up. And I appreciate you being such a generous host when I don't know how to set up all the hosting myself quite yet.
That's right. I can walk you through it. It's no problem at all. All right, guys, all that's left to be said then is that I have been Kristi. Aaron has been awesome. The people in the chat who ignored me, you're still awesome. People in the future watching this, you're awesome too. If you enjoyed this content, you can always support this channel by going to my Patron, or I also have a coffee thing. And if you want to just throw in $1 to say thanks for, the content, if you enjoyed it, I would appreciate it. That's going to be it for this very adventurous starting hangout that ended up being lovely. Goodbye from me and goodbye from Aaron. Say goodbye, Aaron.
Goodbye, Aaron.
You did the bit. Yay, Kevin will be so happy.